There are many reasons for the problems we have in the world today. We could spend several days discussing them. I'm not sure we could come up with any conclusions that would work, because it probably wouldn't. But the one problem I'm talking about is not a problem that the government is necessarily causing. They're involved with it. They're contributing to it somewhat. I don't even think they're aware of it. But the problem I'm talking about is the breakdown of society that we have. And it is a problem. And it's getting worse. It's probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better. The major contribution to this, which seems to cause this problem, is the lack of family structure. And when you want to talk about family, there are so many that are going to think, well, that's out of touch today. It's not reality. You know, we're beyond that. We can do far more without the family. As you well know, it's beginning to fall apart and has been for years. But there's a reason for this problem. And we can discuss the reasons. We can discuss some things to try to make it work and make it better. And it's a problem that could be corrected, but I don't believe that there's enough interest out there to really correct it, other than maybe those of us that are here today and those of us that read their Bible. It's a major problem. And when you look at reality of what is happening throughout society, on some of the statistics I have here, it just boggles your mind with what is being done to our society and some of the problems we have. You know, the problems with the violence in our society, and I have a close friend who's in the police department, and what he's gone through recently is just unbelievable, because it's happening here in Tyler just like some of the other cities, and a lot of us aren't aware of it. But there's a breakdown, and where we are headed is not in the right direction. Some of these statistics here are from 2012. And I just want to share a few of them with you because they're staggering. First marriages among women between the ages of 15 and 44, you can count on a divorce within 10 years. Now that's definitely a breakup of a family right there when that happens. One half of all marriages will end in divorce. That's a pretty staggering figure. I knew it was high. I wasn't quite sure it was that high. I think back in the 70s and early 80s, wasn't it 30% or 35%? But now it's one half. 1/3 of U.S. weddings form step families. Now this is something I can relate to because I'm a part of it. I'll mention that, but I know what step families are like. 40% of U.S. married couples are involved in the step couple relationship. 100 million Americans have step relationships due to different marriages and different families. 40% of U.S. marriages are remarriages for one or both people. You know, this just is getting worse as we go on. It's talking about the breakdown of families, the destruction of the family unit, and of course the children are the ones that are going to pay the price for this. 40% of children born are born out of wedlock. That means they have one of the parents missing. And even in many cases, you know, if they are involved with a marriage with both parents there, usually if as it says here, they're going to divorce, then they've got to fight their way to make their way in society. That doesn't count the abortions that have taken place since 1973. By 15, 29% of U.S. children experience 2 or more partnerships. And I know that for a fact because my oldest grandson is 15 and a half, and his dad has had 2 wives. Of course, my son, his first wife was killed 4.5 years ago, and so he went through, when he was about 11 years old, he really went through the situation with losing his mother. If it hadn't been for my wife, I don't think he would have made it very well, but he did. And my son got married 2 years ago, so they're in a different relationship, and she's got an 8-year-old little boy, and my grandson hasn't been all that happy about it, but we tried to work with him on that. It's one of these situations, you know, that you know what's going to happen because he's not my brother, but he's living in my house as my stepbrother, and there's a lot of friction in there, and it's been humorous, it's been kind of trying at times, and I don't have time to tell you all the situations, but it's been interesting. But these are things that everybody goes through, and you know people that have gone through this. and have had to deal with it. You know, his and I use this as an example because it's something personal. You know, his stepmother now is not his real mother, and there have been a few little complications here and there, and it's worked out over the last couple of years since my son has married her. It's doing okay, and it's on the upswing now. It's for the better, but it's taken work, and I don't think he could have made it through this without me and my wife. I just don't think he could have adjusted as well as he did, because he was to the point where he wanted my son, and that was it. And he still has two stepbrothers and sisters that are 21 and 22, or 22 and 21, that lived with my son after their mother died till they got out on their own, because my son had raised them from the time they were 1.5 and 2.5, because their families didn't want anything to do with them for the most part. And I know this from experience. We've gone through this for several years, and it is not easy. But you know, the one thing that has made it work has been the family unit, the staying together as a family and working together as a family, which we'll get into in a little bit. But you see from these statistics and things that we could sit here and all of you could contribute to some of this because you experienced it and you know somebody. These are facts of reality, which is what is facing our society and our nation today. And unless we have some change, unless we have some movement in a better direction, it's not going to improve much. I could tell you stories all afternoon of things that have happened to me over the last 35 years in my own business. Every single day, for the most part, something comes up. And it's tragic. And it involves employees, their families, their ex-wives, their children. It's just one thing after another. And sometimes I think I'm more of a counselor than a business owner. And I don't mind helping people, I really don't. But on the one hand, you're trying to run a business, and on the other hand, you're trying to help people who have serious problems, and can't get them corrected. But people need help. How many of you can raise your hand, it's not a trick question, how many of you know somebody with serious family problems? I know a lot of them, a lot. I want to tell you about one I heard last night. Just came to me from my wife. This man's probably in his middle 50s. He had a relationship before he got married, so he's got a son somewhere up north. It doesn't have anything to do with him. He's on his third wife. He has two sons living with him with his third wife. His oldest son is 35, still living at home, has a few health problems, but this is not his mother that he's living with. His youngest son is about 28, and this is not his mother either. But apparently he was dragging her around the room by her hair, cussing at her, yelling at her, hitting her. And the one son had mentioned and made the comment that this was kind of an amusing situation for a marriage. Now, how do you think these two young men are going to turn out if they get married? Because they didn't seem to think it was, horribly wrong. It's family violence. Somebody needs to be turned in. But this goes on all the time, not only with him, but with others that I know about. It's all the time that they struggle with this. You can't imagine living in a family under these conditions. A man, woman, children specifically who are going to be the ones that suffer. And your heart goes out to them. It really does, because you see these children who are 2 and 3, 6, 15 that experience this not just once or twice, but week in and week out. What is it going to do to them in a family relationship? Good question. And when you have broken homes, when you have one parent who's basically involved with taking care of the children, the other parent gone, and the one parent has to work to survive and to make it through in this world, and the children are left to themselves, well, what happens? They link up with friends, they link up with neighbors, and not all those people are good people. And it leads to what we have today, where we see some of the things taking place the way they do. Can we fix the problem? Yeah, we could, but I don't really believe people are that interested in it. We're too involved with other things. What was the family supposed to be like from the very beginning? What was the purpose of it? Because there was a need for it. There was a purpose. There was an example for us to look at. Unfortunately, the first family was not a very good example, was it? I'm not talking politically. I'm talking about the first family of creation. A sad situation. How did God feel? I don't think we sometimes understand the feelings that God has, but how did God feel knowing what was going to take place in the first family at creation and where Cain and Abel were headed? God could have stepped in and stopped it, but he didn't. That's part of what we want and desire as human beings, or we demand as human beings, is we demand freedom, and we want freedom. And so God gave us freedom, but he also gave us the freedom to do good and the freedom to do evil and to be wrong. It's a sad situation, but that's what occurred. What did God think when he saw a husband and wife team of Adam and Eve, and when she brought the fruit to Adam, knowing what Adam was probably going to do? God didn't stop it because he knew what was going to take place, and he knew where it was headed and what was going to have to happen to reconcile man with God. But it started with the first family. What a tragic example that was back then. And yet God, I know and understood where it was going to lead mankind, and that it was just going to get worse. It's not a mystery that needs to be solved when you talk about the family structure. It's not something that needs a child psychologist or a family counselor. It doesn't need all of that. You and I are so blessed to have the answers to life for what, and I use the term little we know, because we know a lot, but in some situations we don't really know that much compared to scholars and theologians and people in the world that are considered professional in their fields. We have a little understanding of what God has given us through his Spirit, and we can solve these problems. Some of you have solved the problems with your own families. But a lot of people look at you and look at me as being a little out of date and a little out of touch and a little, backwoodsy, you might say, because of the way we do things. Old-fashioned is a term I'm looking for. My parents used to use that term all the time. And my dad didn't care if he was old-fashioned. He said, I don't care. I'm old-fashioned, that's the way we're going to be. And he was too. But we have so many answers for people, so many opportunities to help them. And you and I have been doing that. And hopefully, you see people changing things from bad to for the better. But so many don't. So many go on and live their lives and are totally unconcerned with what's in this book. When you look in the Old Testament, you don't find a corresponding word for family. About the closest thing you can come to is the word house or the word clan. And that's a much different situation than the term family. A house or clan back then, such as in the case of Abraham, had to do with servants that were his servants, hired hands that probably worked for him. They had not only the wife, but they also had concubines, which that itself is another story with a handful of things to deal with. But they also had children. So you had a much larger scope of people you were talking about when it came to the word clan or house. And yet when you look back in history on some of these things, how these men, such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and different ones, how they ruled their house, if you will, how they had a relationship, how it was a family that was, linked together. They weren't perfect. They had their problems, but they also had the Word of God. When you look at the Scripture that all of us have memorized over the years, I think we recite it, we've memorized it, we know what it means, and we move on to something else. But when you stop and think about it, it is exactly the reason why we are in the situation we are in. It's in the book of Proverbs. I won't have time to turn there, but you know it as well as I do. There is a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And we look at what we think and we feel is right. And you've heard people say, well, we're going to do it this way because I just know from my heart that this is the way to do it. It's the way mankind is with their lives. We don't need God. I know this is what feels right. This is what's going to work. So we're going to do it this way. And how does that turn out? Well, not too well in most cases. But we still keep doing that. People still are led by their emotions of what they feel is best when it's really not. Over in Romans chapter 1, another scripture that you are familiar with, but this is the main reason why we are where we are today. And again, this is going back, and I'm talking to people that already know this, but it's what people need so much to begin to start in dealing with the family and leading the family. Romans 1 verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. Does not that describe our society today? Just ask the lady that's in jail in Kentucky for standing up for what she believed in. Who would have thought this would have happened? And you know what? It's broken up her family because she's been taken to jail because of what she stood for. It just gets your attention, and it staggers your way of thinking to think that it's happened in this country of all places. And this is only the beginning. God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. And yes, that is what has happened. When you reject God, as you well know, when you turn your back on God and say, leave us alone, don't mess with it, that's exactly what happens. And then things begin to fall apart. And the end result, I don't think we're there yet. I think unless we make some changes, unless we do some things differently, our societies are going to get worse. And, your heart and your feelings and your emotions go out for the policemen who are trying to, keep things together. But these men are family members too. They have families. This one person I know that I've been dealing with is a family. He's concerned. He's very concerned for his family because of what he has to do to protect you and me. Proverbs chapter 30 describes a society. It's more of an empty society. As you read the chapter, Proverbs 30 verse 11, there is a generation that curses after their father and does not bless their mother. There is a generation that are pure in their own eyes and yet is not washed from their filthiness. Does that not describe our society today? We've got so much access to so much knowledge. How could we be filthy? How could we be wrong? There is a generation, oh, how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up. There is a generation whose teeth are as swords, their jaw teeth as knives, to devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. Kind of describes an empty society. And no matter how much we profess we have, as far as knowledge available to us today, through whatever media we go to, those of us who look to God's Word and put our trust and faith in God are going to be looked at as being out of touch. We're living in a modern time. We don't need God, as we're going to be told. That does come up. It would do well to go back and to read in the book of Matthew what Jesus thought about little children and how they should be taken care of. He was very strong when he said what he did about children and how special they were to him. And when you realize what a child is, how much it takes to bring them to success, how much it takes to bring them to adulthood, to reach a point where they can function in life and they can live their own lives, it takes a lot of work. I was scared to death when I left to go to college. Because I knew I wasn't going back home. I knew I was going to be on my own from then on. I had never been on my own. Sure, I was coming to a college down here in East Texas that was supposed to be and was a great place to go. But I knew after 4 years, if I survived the 4 years, because I knew it was like boot camp, they told us. I knew after 4 years, what am I going to do then? What's going to happen? I'd never been on my own, and of course my parents had raised me properly. I was a hard worker. Started working full time at 13 and still working full time, but don't feel like 13. Times do change. But what I was brought up in was a family that believed in keeping your word to people and working hard and doing the best you could. You didn't have to have the best of everything. You didn't have to be an important person. As long as you just did certain things and went through certain routines and tried hard, you would be okay. And that's basically the way it is. But you have to get that across to children when they're young, because children are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. And these young children, these teenagers, these people out there creating a mess with society in what they're doing, they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow, some of them. Is that what we want? When you talk and think about families being destroyed, when I saw a few weeks ago the body parts of those children being sold out of, looked like tin cans, those are families that have been destroyed. Not also people. When you see the boy's body wash ashore like it did a couple days ago, that was a family trying to escape the horror over there. It was a family that was destroyed and a life that was cut short. When you see Christians being killed and given 48 hours to leave, you see families' lives being ripped apart. And my thoughts go back, first of all, to what I remember during the history and reading about the fall of Jerusalem during 70 A.D. and how bad it was then. And secondly, it goes back to what I read in the book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer about his early thoughts on what the Nazis were doing in 32 to 34 A.D. He was probably the only person that understood where they were headed and what they were doing. But to see the same things taking place today grabs you like somebody literally putting their hands on you and shaking you, because it's real. And it's happening in places where we never thought it would happen. Christians have become vulnerable. The first thing I think we need to do in helping to build families, and this is what everybody needs, whether they are here listening to this service or somewhere else, but you have that opportunity to deal with them and to help them. And I know you've done that over the years, and probably as long as we remain alive, we will be continuing to do that with people. The first thing they need is education and direction, and the one key is with God included, because too many times people try to leave God out of the picture. They don't believe that God is still working, still alive. And I've heard a few people say recently, if there is a God in heaven, then why doesn't he come down here and do something? I can understand their frustration. I can understand their ignorance. We have been given and blessed with that opportunity to understand God's Word. A little bit of it. As Paul said, looking through a glass darkly. We understand a little bit of the outline of what is happening and what is taking place. And we know that's going to happen. Maybe not necessarily when, but we know it's going to happen, and it's probably going to happen before too long, the way things are headed. You've got to give children education, you've got to give them direction, but you've got to include God with it, because God has to be there. Proverbs 22:6, it's one you've memorized, we don't have to turn there. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. If a child hasn't been trained when they're young, then what do they know and how do they know what to do when they get older? They live like so many people that I have dealt with over the years. They live from day to day, and they don't really care about tomorrow, and it's sad. And you can try to talk with them, you can try to work with them, and they'll kind of shake their head in agreement, and then tomorrow the same thing is done. They just don't learn. Every now and then you come across somebody who will work and who will change their lives. I've got a man working for me right now. This is hard to believe. I've never heard of this before. He's about 35. He's on probation, which that's not something that I'm not familiar with, but he's on probation for 70 years. 70 years. Never heard of this. Had to do with his past drug problem. He's probably one of my best workers. Never late, never misses. Well, of course, the reason he does is because he's going to go back to jail if he does. And he's on probation, literally. He knows this is it. He works hard. He helps to supervise. Doesn't have a driver's license yet, but one of my best workers. He's learned his lesson. And I've talked with him about it, and he said, yeah, I was a fool. I was stupid. And I said, how in the world did you get on probation for 70 years? He said, well, it's not hard if you do the right things. And that's the honest truth. And he knows what he's done. Like I said, a lot of times I feel like a counselor at work, and I don't mind trying to help people. I just wish and hope that some of these people can correct their mistakes and change their way of life. I've got one person that's worked for me for 18 years. He's had similar problems till about 7 or 8 years ago. He straightened up his life, he got married, and now he and his wife are raising her 2 granddaughters because her daughter doesn't want the children. If it wasn't for him and his wife, these kids would probably be out on the street because her 3rd baby's about a year old and she doesn't really want it. But they weren't going to take the 3rd one. That shows you what kind of family that is. They have really helped these 2 children. They're about 8 and 6, I think it is, or 9 and 7. But were it not for them raising these 2 children, these children would have been lost. And he's not even related to to either one of them. But they call him Dad because that's all they know. They don't know their dad. They know their mother occasionally. They see her a few times a year, but they don't know their dad. What kind of a family life is that? I give them credit because he's turned his life around and done a wonderful job with what he has done. Each generation, this is what was supposed to be from the beginning of creation with the first family, with Adam and Eve. What did God tell them to do, Adam and Eve? To go replenish the earth. You know what was supposed to happen? As they replenished the earth, it was supposed to get better with each succeeding generation. Didn't turn out that way, did it? It had some shortcomings because they didn't do their job. Mankind didn't do what they were supposed to do. They threw God out of the picture. You remember what it says about the flood? Because man's heart was evil continually, God had to come down and do something. I still can't comprehend that God would have to destroy the entire world because it was that corrupt and that evil. But he did. You just can't get your mind around that being that way when you think of the world that we live in today, can you? With the things that are going on. Problem is, our minds are not always intent on doing the evil things. We're trying to change our lives and turn them around. So, there are more of us than just Noah's family. But it was only Noah's family and his relationship with that family that allowed them to be able to go through the flood. That society was that bad. Each generation should get better. We should correct the problems of the past generation. As parents, we should help our children conquer the pitfalls that we've gotten ourselves into, to overcome the mistakes that we have made, and to point those out to them. You can't do this, not because God says you can't do it, because God's right. We've done it and we tried it and it didn't work. We need to change that. We need to correct that. That's what we have to do as people. Because these children are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, one way or the other. And they're going to pass what they know, what they've learned, and what they've experienced on to their children or to your grandchildren. So where does that lead society? Well, if every society, every generation in society got better, if it always improved, there would be a tremendous amount of hope to think about. But right now, my hope for the way mankind is headed, the way that just this nation is headed with the young people is of concern to me. And I'm not that old. Some of you that are older than I am probably look at this country today and shake your head and think, I don't even recognize it. I mean, I grew up in the 60s. You talk about change, that about destroyed my dad, who was an ex-Marine. But he survived it, and that was nothing compared to what we're going through today. We've got some course corrections to make. You know, when you read in the book of Hebrews, and I'm not going to turn there either, I just want to mention, but in Hebrews chapter 11 is the faith chapter. And when you turn to that chapter, you read about people who were involved with God and who had faith in God and believed in Him. And it made the reference to Abraham and Isaac of Jacob, which was a family. God, in many cases, down through history, has used families, as you well know. But one of the things that was mentioned about them as a family was that they were going to be heirs of the promise. And what about your family and my family and everybody else's family? What do we have a chance to become? What do your children and grandchildren have a chance to become? The same thing, heirs of the promise that God has given to mankind. Heirs. Eternal life, to become a son of God. It's there. It's for the taking. God says that He will give it to us, but we've got to turn to Him. So we've got to put God in our lives. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Beginning in verse 4. I'm just going to cover this very briefly, just parts of it. This has to do with what God told the people of Israel they needed to do when He gave them His law. And they took them out of Egypt and they were getting ready to head to the promised land. He was very specific in what He expected of them. And He did it for a reason, because He was trying to tell them that what you're going to do and what you're going to believe in and the way you're going to live your lives has got to be a certain way to pass it on to your children so that you will survive where they were headed. He said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart." What do you think He had them teach them to the children diligently? So that it would remain a part of them. Teach them diligently to your children, and talk of them when you lie down, when you sit in the house, when you walk by the way. Whatever you're doing in life, teach them to your children. Make sure that they understand that. Bind them for a sign upon your hand and on your frontlets between your eyes, and write them upon the posts of your house and on your gates. For a reason, so they wouldn't forget. You know, when you see these day in and day out, when you read these words day in and day out, when you try to live by them day in and day out, it can make a change in your life. It can make a difference. And it can help your children. Because as we're going to see, there's something else we need to be doing. The second point is your example as a parent. Boy, it's hard to be a good example to your children when you turn and go the other direction. I know my grandmother, when I was about 5 or 6 years old, washed my mouth out with soap. Lava soap, the rough soap, because I said a curse word. And I heard it from my grandfather, who said it to a friend of his while I was playing close by. I don't know what she did to my grandfather, but my mouth was washed out with lava soap, and it was not pleasant. But she tried to impress upon me that I should never, ever use words like that. And I don't think we see that happening much nowadays. Pretty much everybody says whatever they want, and nobody ever says anything. In certain circles. You know, we don't put up with it in our circle, in my circle, and with our grandchildren, and they understand that very, very well. But you've got to start somewhere. You've got to do things a certain way. When my wife and I were talking the other night, we were discussing about the calling of our parents and what difference that made to her family and to my family as we were growing up. Her parents were called into the church about 1948 at that time, I think it was still the Radio Church of God back then. I don't remember the exact name, but it was 1948. So when she was born in 52, her parents were attending church. Her dad and both of her older brothers were ministers. In my case, my dad started listening in 58. He was all excited about it, but just didn't want to go to church as of yet. So until 65, it was my mother who brought me to church and put me in touch with it. But what we talked about was that our parents brought us and our family into contact with God, which didn't exist before. It just didn't. They brought us into contact with God as a family. It taught us to focus on God's law as a certain way to live your life, how to conduct yourself in life. And also that was always passed on down to the next generation somewhat, to the grandkids, because of what it has done through us. It gave us direction. It gave us stability, because neither her parents nor my parents were ever divorced. It brought order to the family situation. In her case, her dad was pretty strict. My dad was an ex-Marine. He was strict when he said something, but he kind of let you be yourself and kind of live your own life. But when he said something, you better do it. The alternative was not pleasant. And I tried a couple times. I tried to do what I wanted, but it didn't work. I lost. But it also provided us with goals to live by. Seek you first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. This is what it provided for the family environment in her case and in our case. And it stuck with us throughout our lives. And it made a difference. Now, if you were to multiply that by 1 million or 10 million or 100 million, think how many people's lives could be changed, because it all goes back to having God as a part of your life and focusing on God for what He has done for you and given to you and what He expects of mankind. God didn't just throw us out here, leave us on our own to fend for ourselves. He gave us something to live by. Just people don't want to do it. So the problems we have made are our own. And the way to correct them is not to have God come down here and correct them for us, is to correct them ourselves with God's Word and God's help. But unless we're willing to do that, God is not going to force us to do anything. He won't do that. He goes on to say in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6, the rest of chapter 6, 7, and 8, he warns them, he says, when you have become fed, when you're blessed, when you've got everything you need, when you've got all sorts of the wealth that you could possibly imagine, and that's talking about Israel, but I guarantee you it reflects upon us today, because we've got everything we could possibly imagine and could need and could have compared to the rest of the world. He says, when you get to that point in life, don't forget me. Because he says you're going to pay for it. He says in verse 20 of chapter 8, as the nations which the Lord destroyed before your face, so shall you perish, because you would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. It concerns me when I see us throwing God out of our society in every possible way we can, and then read this scripture. Because I know what God did to those nations before Israel. I know what He did. Now granted, He did use Nebuchadnezzar as His servant in taking Judah captivity. And God said, I was reading that last night in the book of Jeremiah, God said, Nebuchadnezzar's my servant. You're going into captivity. You're going to stay there for 70 years, and you're not coming out. And when I say it's time, then you can come out. Because they didn't obey God. And Nebuchadnezzar's not around today, but a lot of his descendants are. And so I get concerned when I see what took place in the Old Testament with Babylon and with Assyria. And you know what they referred to them as in ancient times? They were terrorists. They were so brutal. They were so horrible. And when I see the descendants of those people kind to do the same thing again. And when I see us throwing God out and destroying everything that we ever have to stand for, it concerns me. There was a story 2 or 3 weeks ago of a lady. I don't even remember what show this was on. It was just something in passing. And they were asking her some questions about some Bible stories. And she had no idea what they were talking about. I think she was in her late 30s, if I remember correctly. And they kept trying to discuss some of these common Bible stories. It was about Noah and Moses and different things. And finally she said, wait a minute, I think I remember my grandmother reading some of these to me when I was 3 or 4 years old. She didn't know anything about the common stories that are a given for most kids, you would think. 4% of the people in Europe attend church. You believe that? 4%. They're being lost from God because of walking away and having nothing to do with it. Where will our culture wind up in 10 years in this country? Where will it wind up in 20 years at the rate we're going? It's a good question. How many people do parents influence? Did you ever think of that? Well, first of all, they influence their children. If you have children, you just do. Whether you're good or bad, you're going to influence them, believe me. The kids tend to pick up the bad easier and quicker than the good. I don't know why that is, they just do. And then parents can discuss as they get older how he's like you, he's picked up your bad habits, you know. That's something we always think about. Well, they're also going to impact their children's friends as the friends come over and spend time with one another. That's just a given. And then as the children get older, as grandparents, you're going to impact the grandchildren. Believe me, we've had a great impact upon our grandkids and our step-grandkids. They look at us as grandpa and grandma. They really do. My 2 step-grandchildren are half Hispanic, and they look upon us as their only grandparents for the most part, because nobody else wants anything to do with them. My recent step-grandchild, who we refer to as our grandchild, is 8 years old, and his mother is from India. She was born in New York, but he's Indian. Great little boy, full of energy. And he looks at us as grandparents. Her parents live in India. They were Pentecostal missionaries for 20 years here in Dallas, and they've moved back to retire back in India. And so he doesn't see his grandparents on his mother's side. So he only sees us. And his dad lives in Dallas and has some contact with him, but not a lot. There's some rough situations there that have developed over the years. But he looks at us as grandparents. And it's wonderful to be able to have an impact in kids. And when he comes over here, I've only known him for 2 years, but you would think he's known us all of his life. He's picked it up and he loves coming. You know, one of the things that we can do as we get together, especially for the feast and meet together on God's appointed times, is make sure that the family life and family structure is well put together and well in place. There are a lot of other people that are going to take note of that and realize that. Because there are a lot of people out there right now who are after young people, children, for the worse. I was in Toronto first week of August. We took the 2 grandsons, age 14 and 15, to Niagara Falls and then up into Toronto. We came out of the movie theater. It was a big IMAX theater, and we had gone in to see the latest Mission Impossible movie, which was great. We came out of the theater, and the 2 boys and my wife didn't notice this. I'm always looking around. I guess I'm paranoid, but I'm always looking over my shoulder. I'm taking note of things because I know how society is, but there were just people everywhere. Right across from the IMAX theater, where young people were coming out, were some vendors. And when I saw them, the thought hit me, I wonder who's over there. And sure enough, we went by them, walked through them, headed back to the hotel. There was a table there with two gentlemen, late 20s, well-dressed, nice-looking booklets, one sitting down, passing them out, one on the street trying to engage the young people. Come and join ISIS. Right there on the street corner, across from the theaters. Now, it sent a chill up and down my back. I wasn't surprised by it because I was kind of watching for it. But this is where these people are, and they're after your young people. They're after children to get involved. It's alive. Evil is alive and well. And the destruction of the family unit is something that is still going on and going to take place until Christ returns. No, they're out there and they're trying to serve a purpose, and it's evil. And it's something that has to be stopped. Watch your children. Provide them, as I mentioned before, as a second point, an example with love involved. You know, one of the tragic stories with the people of Israel occurred in the first book of Samuel, chapter 8. You know, in chapter 8, verse 7, there's a verse you've heard for years and years and years, you know, where Samuel came to God. And God said, Samuel, the people have not rejected you, but they rejected me that I should not reign over them. You know what happened in the first 6 verses? Samuel's sons were horrible examples. And the people were upset and frustrated by that. And that turned them and caused them to kind of go the different direction. And the people were tired of people, tired of God's minister, if you will, with his 2 children that were rebellious. You can read that in your spare time because it's an interesting example that that's what it led to. You know, in spite of everything Samuel had done and how good that he was as a prophet and what he did and everything through history, his children didn't turn out well. And that was one of the reasons that they rejected God. They wanted their own king and wanted God to kind of move aside. They wanted somebody they could look to. There are so many troubled stories out there with people, as I've mentioned, and it's just tragic with what you go through. One of my dear friends died 3 weeks ago. He was a man that helped build this Salvation Army Center of Hope downtown. Wonderful individual, known him for years, had dinner with him usually once a month. He was a former lieutenant colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers. Just a wonderful individual who was involved with charities all over the place. But I didn't realize till I got to looking at one of the books he wrote. He wrote a book called Choices. And at 16, his mother, who was pregnant with him, went to live with her parents because it's all she had. And this man grew up in a really rough time with nothing, virtually nothing. He tried to join the Army at 16. And they accepted him, but they caught him after about a month, so they kicked him out. So then he joined the Merchant Marines. And when he was 18, he wound up going back and joining the Army Corps of Engineers. But he was determined that he was never going to let life get the best of him. He was going to conquer it. And he was not going to grow up or let his children grow up the way he grew up. And it was really funny to hear him tell the story because he used to think he really tricked him at 16 to try to join, because he wanted to serve his country. And he was too young to serve during World War II, so he actually served during the Korean War. And he died of cancer because he was one of the supervisors when they tested all the nuclear missiles and weapons in Nevada. He was there for month after month after month. In fact, he was there the same time my dad was there, being used as a guinea pig when they would send him out and set one off and then have him come back inside. But he had too much of it, and he had cancer 7 or 8 times. And it finally got the best of him. But he used to talk about his family. He died a multimillionaire, very well-to-do, but you'd never known it. He was never that way. He just said he wanted his family to experience something that he never had a chance to experience as a child. And he made a difference in their lives. And that's what we're supposed to do as people. We're supposed to see and try to see what happens as every generation gets better and improves and corrects the mistake of the past. Proverbs 25 and verse 28. This is probably one of the most important points as far as you as a parent trying to get across to your children. The scripture is important too, but it has to do with building character. Proverbs 25:28. He that has no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. You've got to help children know when to say no. You've got to teach children what right and wrong is, which is one of the shortcomings of our society today. There is nothing that's wrong. Everything is open. You know, when you think of the term of the 60s, turn on, tune in, and drop out, it's a whole new ballgame today. Today's motto would be anything goes. And that's not for the better, believe me. It just isn't. You know what true character really is? It's what you do when no one is around. That is what true character is. How you conduct your life when no one is there to watch over you. God's always going to be watching you, don't get me wrong. But I mean when your parents aren't around, when your friends aren't around, when you're by yourself, what you do is what true character is. You've got to have self-control. You've got to know when to stop doing some things. If you want to correct yourself financially, don't be spending, $100 a week on beer and cigarettes. That's where you can start first. If you want to survive in life, you've got to begin to put a plan together to make some changes. It's not going to change for you, and nobody's going to do it for you. You're on your own. And crime isn't going to pay. It might for a little period of time, but not for very long, because you're going to get caught. And you might wind up with 70 years probation, or a lot worse. I don't know about people sometimes. The family. Proverbs 27, verse 17. Point number 3. Family should be used for strength and support in trouble. It should be a fortress where you can go to get advice and get help. Iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friends. The family should be a place where children could come and get help. Our children come to us all the time, not as much as they used to. They're on their own, they're married, they're 40 and 37, they don't need us much, but every now and then they call for advice, or what do you think? What do you think about this? Or what did you do in the past when this happened? And you can share with them. You can share with them the positive things that you've done that worked, and you can share with them the things that didn't work at all. When you keep getting married and keep getting divorced, you're going to lose half of what you have. It's a simple fact in the state of Texas. You just are. And when you've had 4 or 5 wives, as I know several that have, you're not going to get ahead financially. You just aren't. Yet, they think that's the way to correct their problems. And may I be a little more specific to some of the younger people today? If you want to make it through life, you got to get a job and work. You really do. This is something that is, let me tell you what happened 2 weeks ago. You're going to love this. You may not sleep very well at night after I tell you, but you're going to love it. It bothers me a lot, believe me. This young man came to work. He was about 19, looking for a job, physically fit, healthy. Middle of August, 102 or 3 degrees. First day, he about fainted. And he said, "Is it like this every day?" And I said, "Well, yeah, there's not much I can do about it. It just is." And so the next day he came to work, and he was working through this Express Personnel, which is who I use for personnel right now. And so he worked another half a day, and he came to me at noon, and he said, I can't do this. I'm going to have to quit. And I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "I understand." I said, "Not everybody can work in the heat." And I said, it's hot out there. It's tough. And I said, "If you need to find something else, then I understand that." I said, "Just go ahead and go back to Express, and they'll find something for you. They're real good about that. I'll call them and tell them that you were on time and, that you did your best and it just didn't work. And he said, well, I'd appreciate that. He said, but don't worry about calling them. He said, I really don't need to work right now. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm joining the military in 30 days. And I said, the military? I said, you know how tough it is in the military? And he said, oh no. He said, but it's going to be a lot of fun. And I thought, if this is what our military is going to be like, with this kind of personnel in there, we are headed for trouble, serious trouble. This was a fact. I didn't make this up. And it's not the first thing that's come up. No, it's as Paul said, and Paul was pretty tough on people. He said, if you don't work, neither should you eat. That's pretty harsh. But there are a lot of people out there that just plain don't want to work. They want to spend time on their iPhones and everything else, literally. One of the ladies over at Express Personnel that I deal with told me 2 weeks ago also that somebody came in and said that they were not going to be able to work today. She said, why? She said the person looked at her and said, I'm just not mentally set to work today. I can't handle it. I said, this is the truth. She said, this is the truth. And she said, this comes up more than once. So yeah, we need to educate some children. Let me conclude this before we go on. But we need to work with the family situation. We need to work with children. We need to work with the structure that's going to help our society become stronger. Because we are facing some tough times as a nation and as a people. And treaties and harsh words and threats and telling people you don't have time to do this because you don't want to work is not going to cut it in society. It's going to take effort. It's going to take a lot of work. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 14. If you could just get children to read Proverbs, there's so much knowledge in the book of Proverbs to help young people change their lives, especially when it comes to women walking the streets in the evenings. I mean, there's several chapters on that, and that's how most of the people that work for me have gotten themselves in trouble. And it's cost them dearly. And it hasn't been able to change their lives yet. Proverbs 11, verse 14, a talebearer reveals secrets, but he that is faithful, spirit conceals them. That's not the right verse. 11, 14, here we go, 14. Where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety. What better place to get counseling than the family structure, the family unit? Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, if you have them. Most of those don't live that long, and you're not old enough to understand. But they have so much to offer young people. In conclusions, Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 6. The one thing you strive for as a parent. Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. I never thought I would be involved with grandchildren so much, but they're so much more fun, I think, sometimes in children because they're only there part of the time, and you can spoil them all you want, as you well understand, and then send them home and let the parents straighten them out. But no, you can provide for them. You can do special things for them, and they appreciate it so much. And grandchildren know where their bread is buttered, believe me. They really do. Children are very special. It takes a lot to bring them to a success. It takes a secure family, not a village. It takes instruction, good examples, and support with love that you have as a part of your life to pass on to them. Let's work on the family unit. Try to help other people see that and give people advice when it happens. And if you can just pass some of this knowledge on to other people, maybe it will just help them in restructuring their families.